These images should not exist. Those are not my words. They are, in essence, the position taken by Leonid Kazan-Formality, a senior scientist at the Russian Academy of Sciences, head of its Planetary physics laboratory, and one of the men who helped build the cameras that took the only photographs ever captured on the surface of Venus. In 2012, after studying those images for 30 years, Kazan-Formality published a paper in a peer-reviewed Russian journal claiming that the photographs taken by the Soviet probe Venera 13 in 1982 showed objects that appeared to move. Objects that appeared, in his words, to be alive. Now, he was not a fringe figure. He was not an amateur. He was one of the few people on Earth who knew the original Venera mission data intimately, and he looked at it decades later and concluded that something in those frames was crawling across the surface of the hottest planet in the solar system. The international scientific community rejected his claim within weeks. They were almost certainly right to. But the explanation for what was actually moving in those images turned out to be something that most people have never heard. And once you understand it, the photographs become far more disturbing than if he had been correct. This is the story of the only images ever taken on the surface of Venus, the scientist who refused to look away from them, and what was actually moving in the frame. Now, to understand the warning, you first have to understand where these images came from and why almost nobody has ever seen them. Venus is the closest planet to Earth, and for a long time scientists called it our twin. It is nearly identical in size and mass, and was, billions of years ago, almost certainly Earth-like, with liquid water on its surface. We know this because the ratio of hydrogen isotopes left in its atmosphere points to oceans that once existed and then boiled away into space. Then, a runaway greenhouse effect turned our twin into the most hostile place in the inner solar system. The surface of Venus sits at 465 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. The atmospheric pressure is 92 times Earth's, the equivalent of being nearly a kilometre underwater. The sky is permanently choked with clouds of sulfuric acid, and the air is so dense it behaves more like a fluid than a gas. Nothing built by human hands was ever supposed to survive there. But the Soviet Union decided to try anyway. Now, while America committed to Mars, the Soviets committed to Venus, launching 18 probes between 1961 and 1984. Now, their early landers were crushed in the atmosphere before they ever reached the ground. So the engineers stopped building spacecraft and started building what were essentially submarines. Titanium pressure spheres, pre-cooled to below freezing before descent, packed with heat-absorbing material to buy a few extra minutes of life. 4 of those probes returned images. Venera 9 and 10 in 1975 sent back the first photographs ever taken on the surface of another planet, in black and white. Then, in 1982, came Venera 13. Now, Venera 13 was the masterpiece. It landed in a region called Phoebe Regio, and although it was designed to survive for just over half an hour, it lasted 127 minutes, the longest of any Venera mission. It carried color cameras that scanned the surface in red, green, and blue passes. It carried a microphone that recorded the first sounds from another planet, the low moan of the dense wind and the sharp grinding of its own drill biting into rock. And it returned a series of colour panoramas of an orange, rock-strewn hellscape lit by dim, sunless glow because the thick atmosphere filters out every colour except orange before the light ever reaches the ground. Now, those panoramas are the only colour photographs ever taken on the surface of Venus. They have not been added to in 43 years. No nation has returned to the surface since the Soviet Vega missions of 1985. The images exist in archives most people never open, taken by a country that no longer exists. And one man spent the rest of his life staring at them. Leonid Kazan-Formality was born in 1932. He was a physicist, a senior researcher at the Space Research Institute of the Soviet and later Russian Academy of Sciences. He worked on the Venera program directly. He helped design instruments that flew to Venus. He understood the cameras, the conditions, and the data better than almost anyone alive. And this is what made what happened next so difficult for his colleagues to dismiss. You see, in January 2012, 30 years after Venera 13 landed, Kazan-Formality published a paper in the journal Solar System Research that stunned everyone who read it. He had not been looking at the polished single images that most people see. He had been studying the raw sequence, the fact that Venera 13's cameras did not take one photograph, but scanned the same area repeatedly over the 127 minutes the probe survived. Each scan was separated by several minutes, and when Kazan-Formality laid those sequential scans side by side, he saw things that were not in one frame and then were in the next. Things that appeared to change position. Things that appeared to him to move. And he gave them names. There was an object he called the disk, a flat, rounded shape. There was a long, segmented form near the lander that he compared to a scorpion. And there was a dark structure he described as a flap, which appeared to shift and change over the course of the observations. Kazan-Formality's interpretation was extraordinary. He proposed that these were not rocks, not equipment, not noise. He suggested they might be living organisms, exotic life adapted to the impossible conditions of Venus. He even hypothesized a sequence of events, that the sounds and vibrations of the lander touching down had startled the creature, that some had fled the immediate area while others had been buried by the disturbance, and that over the next hour and a half they had slowly re-emerged from the soil. In his paper, he wrote that the object's features were such that no one could, in his words, boldly suggest they were alive. A senior member of the Russian Academy of Sciences had just claimed in print the Soviet Union photographed life on the surface of Venus in 1982. Now, the response from the rest of the world was swift, and it was not kind. The leading voice against the claim was Ted Strike, an American researcher and one of the most respected reprocessors of Venera imagery in the world. A man who had spent years pulling clean images out of the degraded Soviet data. Strike examined Kazan-Formality's evidence and reached a blunt conclusion. The moving objects, he said, were not in the original data at all. They were artifacts, noise, scanline errors, and compression damage that appeared in particularly poor versions of the images, the kind Kazan-Formality had been working from. In Strike's own words, the features were nothing more than processed noise at best in some especially bad versions of the images, and they were not present in the original transmissions. The Planetary Society published a detailed debunking. The disk, it turned out, was almost certainly a lens cap, the protective covers that the Venera probes ejected after landing, which had a documented habit of falling directly into the camera's field of view. The problem was so common that on the sister probe, Venera 14, an ejected lens cap landed precisely where the lander's soil testing arm was about to strike, causing it to measure the compressibility of its own cap instead of the Venusian ground. The Scorpion was a smear of image noise that only appeared in degraded scans, and the apparent movement was an illusion created by the camera's slow line-by-line scanning combined with the shifting noise patterns between passes. By every standard of evidence, Kazan-Formality was wrong. There was no Scorpion, there was no life. The mainstream consensus settled, and it has not moved since. But there is a detail buried inside the debunking that almost nobody talks about, and it is far more unsettling than the claim it replaced. Because something in those images was changing between scans. The objects weren't alive, but they were real features in the data that genuinely shifted over the 127 minutes. So, what were they? Well, the answer is that they were pieces of Venera 13 itself. As the lander sat on the surface of Venus, it was being destroyed. The temperature was 465 degrees. The pressure was 92 atmospheres. The probe's external components, insulation, plastic fittings, structural panels, were softening, warping, melting, and breaking away under conditions that no material could withstand for long. Over the course of the observation, debris from the dying lander shifted, slumped, and fell into the camera's view. The soil disturbed by the landing settled. Components sagged out of position and slid across the rock. The movement Kazan Formality saw was real movement. It just wasn't life. It was the slow death of the machine, captured frame by frame by its own cameras as Venus systematically tore it apart. Now, what Venera 13 actually photographed across those 127 minutes was its own destruction. The panoramas are not a static portrait of an alien world. They are a recording of a probe being killed in real time. The insulation peeling, the structure failing, the pieces scattering across the orange rock. Until, at 127 minutes, the heat finally reached the electronics and transmission stopped forever. That is what makes the images so difficult to look at once you understand them. Kazan Formality spent 30 years searching those frames for life. What he was actually looking at was a death. Slow, mechanical, and absolute. He saw something moving and his mind reached for the most hopeful explanation, that Venus held life. But the truth was the opposite. The only thing moving on the surface of Venus was the thing we sent there coming apart. Kazan Formality died in 2019. He never retracted his claim. To the end, one of the men who knew the Venera missions better than anyone believed there was something alive in those photographs. The scientific community remembers him as brilliant and as wrong about this one thing. A respected physicist who, late in his career, saw a pattern in the noise and could not let it go. And maybe that is the most human part of the entire story. We sent a machine to the worst place in the solar system. It survived just long enough to photograph itself dying. And decades later, a man who had helped build it looked at those images of destruction and saw instead the thing every scientist secretly hopes to find. Life where there should be none. There was no life. There was only the machine and the heat and the silence that followed. No one has returned to the surface of Venus since 1985. The next mission, NASA's Da Vinci, will not arrive until the 2030s, and it is not designed to survive on the surface for long. For now, and for years to come, the only images we have of the ground of Earth's twin remain the ones Venera 13 transmitted as it died. The ones a Soviet scientist swore showed something that should not exist. He was wrong about what was moving, but he was right about one thing. These images should not exist. By every law of physics, nothing we built should have survived long enough to take them at all. And the fact that they exist anyway, taken by a dead probe for a vanished country on a planet that destroys everything we send, may be stranger than any scorpion.